A educação que funciona é aquela em que você aprende o tempo todo com qualquer pessoa e também em qualquer lugar. Na verdade, é um conceito de comunidade de aprendizagem, formando uma rede de conhecimento na qual as pessoas possam usufruir e aprender mais. Eu introduzo o nosso convidado aqui, o Dougald Hine, que, como eu, é jornalista, e certamente isso daí acabou influenciando a ele ter uma visão diferente da informação e também ele acabou tendo uma visão da educação, ou seja, ele misturou as linguagens da educação e do jornalismo e da comunicação para ter um conceito de comunidade de aprendizagem em que você aprende em qualquer lugar, com qualquer pessoa, a toda hora e de qualquer jeito. É o jeito mais contemporâneo de se imaginar a educação.
So, I was wondering what object I wanted to take out of the box. And I thought, if there's a new world which is struggling to be born, the thing that I really want to talk to you about is how we learn to recognize it, how we see how much of that new world is already here around us. So, it's time for 3D glasses. In my final year at university, a friend of mine was on track to get one of the highest results in our class. One day, she had a conversation with her professor. 10 years ago, he told her, I would have insisted that you stay on and do a doctorate. The way things are going, just get your first and get out of here. My life has been shaped by the company of a kind of university in exile, made up of people who would most likely have gone into academia a generation or two ago, but who saw the growing crisis in our systems of education and decided to take their chances elsewhere. Throughout my 20s, I kept coming across other members of this invisible college. I learned more in their company than I did in my time at university, because we were led by our own passion and curiosity, and because the networked technologies available to us made it easy to find each other and to get access to the resources we needed. Today, I want to tell you about what we learned, the projects we ended up creating, and the gamble to which it has led me. That our story has been one small thread of a much larger fabric of learning and collaboration, an invisible college that is coming into being on a global scale, and that is bringing our existing institutions of education to something we might call their Napster moment. It is a gamble, because this is the background against which everything we've been talking about today is taking place. We live in deeply uncertain times. We have institutional, financial, and ecological crises unfolding before us, whilst network technologies rewrite the social rules for how these crises play out. Let's start, though, with the deep social good at the heart of education. That there should be ways in which learning is passed on from one generation to the next. People to who you can go to learn particular skills. And places within society that are dedicated to the cultivation of knowledge. Now, this is rather old-fashioned language, but I use it deliberately because one of the places where I think we go wrong as we talk about how technology changes society is we forget how little people change from century to century. Radical changes often come when we find a new way to make room for something old. Something that has been pushed aside for a time, something that meets our deep needs. These deep needs are older than the institutions and structures that happen to have been meeting them for the past few generations. Think about music. The way the record companies talk, you'd think that music had never existed without them. But we know that music is a deeply ancient part of being human. Things that matter to us as much as music, will outlast the rise and fall of business models, industries, technologies, institutions, and civilizations. And the same goes for the deep good at the heart of education. And when our existing institutions choose to focus on other things, on driving economic growth, on acting as gatekeepers to control access to high social status jobs, we shouldn't be surprised if those deep needs find new homes in unexpected places. I graduated 10 years ago and went into a career as a BBC journalist. Exactly the kind of high-status job university was supposed to be a springboard into. But within a year, I had quit. The gap between outward success and an internal sense of lostness was too strong to ignore. And pretty soon, I found myself coming across others in the same situation, looking for a meaningful path through life, and discovering that the University Careers Service didn't have much to offer us. Instead, we stumbled into projects like the University of Openness, a wiki where anyone could create their own research project, or the email magazine Pick Me Up, which was started by some friends of mine in London in 2004. Pick Me Up was a magazine about DIY culture that was written by its readers. We had open editorial meetings that anyone could come along to. It came out on a Friday afternoon, and it was designed to inspire you to do something more interesting than checking your inbox on a Friday afternoon. A bit like Fight Club, there were 2 rules to Pick Me Up. The first rule was you couldn't be a journalist telling a story about something that someone else had done. You had to get involved and make something happen, and then tell that story from the inside. The second rule was you couldn't tell the story in a way which would make people feel, wow, I wish I could do that. You had to tell the story in a way that would make them feel, I could do that. It could be big or small. Everything from some students in Sheffield who installed an old piano on the street outside their house, to 5 crazy Scandinavian girls from the Chaos Pilots, a cross between an art school and a business school, who went to Sarajevo and mobilized hundreds of young Bosnians to take over a bombed-out concert hall and demand that the government gave it back to the young people of the city. Being part of Pick Me Up was an initiation into a craft of creating projects and making things happen. And along with all of the fun and playful stuff that we did, the most serious projects we found ourselves coming back to were the ones that involved creating new spaces for learning. There was the London School of Art and Business, inspired by the Chaos Pilots, and School of Everything, a website that makes it really easy to find people near you who are interested in learning or teaching the same things that you are, so you can organize your learning outside of institutions. By this stage, what had started off as DIY experiments in our spare time were turning into something that people were taking seriously. School of Everything became an internet startup with investors and tens of thousands of members. We won awards and got written about in the newspapers. We didn't get everything right. There was a radical passion at the heart of School of Everything, but we allowed ourselves to get off track, to build something investable, rather than listening to our guts. What we got wrong was that we built a system for exchange, what Cory Doctorow called an eBay for learning, when we knew that learning isn't a commodity that you can sell on a market. It's something that happens between people, in relationships, over time. But here's the bit we got right. We knew that the most powerful thing about the internet wasn't going to be spending more and more of our lives in front of screens. And this was at a time when British universities were getting really excited about building campuses in Second Life. Meanwhile, we were out there talking about First Life, about the power of these technologies to bring people together in the flesh and make things happen. And that was less obvious back then than it is now that everything from a birthday party to a revolution is organized over social networks. The next thing that happened was a group of young artists and activists took over this huge, old, empty mansion right in the center of London and opened something called the Temporary School of Thought. a 3-week-long free university that became an extraordinary crossing point between worlds. Admittedly, that's not quite how the newspapers described it. But when they invited me to come down there and give a talk, I found myself reconnecting to the spirit of the projects that I'd been involved in before I became an accidental internet entrepreneur. And soon after that, I stepped back from the running of School of Everything. And one of the new things I started was a meetup group inspired by this idea of making creative use of empty spaces. And this was early 2009. The global economic crisis was beginning to come home to countries like Britain. And people were wondering what we were going to do with all of these empty shops and offices. In our meetup, we were talking about how could we connect this to long-term changes in the ways we were organizing our lives, in the kinds of space we wanted to live and work in, to the new co-working spaces that many of us had come across in our cities, and to the long-term questions of how we create sustainable local economies. And because we were hosting that conversation, face-to-face and online, we started to get contacted by local governments and property owners who wanted to talk to someone who understood this new DIY culture of making spaces. So out of the meetup group came a company, Space Makers Agency, whose first project was to take on 20 empty shops in an indoor market in Brixton, South London, and transform them into a rolling festival of temporary creative and community projects, makers, artists, and new long-term independent local businesses. 2 years on, we've left, but that market is still there and thriving. In fact, all of the shops in the market are now occupied for the first time since 1979. Space Makers has gone on to work around London and around the UK, and we're just one part of a wider movement for the creative, collaborative reimagining of the spaces in which we live. Now, it might sound like what we do with Space Makers doesn't have a lot to do with the future of education. But there's a thread here, a DIY spirit, and a culture of reflection on deep social questions that runs through Pick Me Up, the School of Everything, the University of Openness, and all of these projects. And it's all grounded in the existence of this community of thinkers and doers who chose to take their chances outside of academic institutions and who have found the network makes it less lonely to be working on the outside. And there's something happening here, and my bet is that we're just at the beginning. Someone who's helped crystallize that for me lately is another internet entrepreneur, someone else who's inspired by the way in which people can use these technologies to get together in the places where they live. John Garaci, co-founder of Outside In. John's been arguing that over the next 10 years or so, we're going to see the co-working spaces and incubators, the hack spaces and maker spaces, the fab labs and media labs, and all of these other new sociable, collaborative, productive spaces mature into something that becomes a real alternative to the university as we know it. And what I've realized as I go around talking to people, visiting projects, and working with spaces like the Hub Westminster in London, or the Foam Art and Science Lab in Brussels, where I was last week, is that it's already happening from all of these different directions at once. And the challenge really is to tell the story so that we notice it. You know, you go to the Netherlands and you'll find a group of artists who are creating a distributed university, linking up projects and spaces across their city. Access Space in Sheffield recycles old computers, uses free open source software to create this space for creativity and technology that's become the longest running digital learning center in the UK. Meanwhile, 10 years ago, a couple of activists from Brazil visited that space in Sheffield and came back with an idea that became the Meta Recyclagum network. These spaces, they run on small amounts of money and huge amounts of passion. They run by trial and error. They don't have expansion plans. They spread the way that a joke spreads. One person tells it to another and another. And if it's good enough, then pretty soon it's on the other side of the world. So how is all of this going to play out? Is the education industry really where the music industry was 15 years ago? about to be hit by a wall of network disruption? To answer that, we need an understanding of what happened in 1999. When Napster came along, they made it massively easier for ordinary internet users to share their music collections. And that knocked the business model of a whole industry sideways. But it wasn't just technology that created the Napster moment. What made file sharing such a powerful force for disruption was the gap between the music industry's model of reality and the lived experience of pretty much everybody else. The record companies will tell you that piracy is theft. But if you've ever listened to music on the radio or made a tape of your favorite songs for a friend, you know that whatever else, listening to music, copying music without paying for it is not the same kind of thing as walking into a store, picking up a bar of candy and walking out without paying for it. That gap between the official version of reality and people's lived experience had been there for years. And it was through that gap that when Napster came along, millions of people poured into the new world of file sharing. And we're still working out what that means for the future of music. Networks are really good at showing up these gaps. They have a way of transforming them from background tensions into active sources of disruption. Think about what happened at South by Southwest and conferences like that in 2007, 2008, when Twitter first came along. Before that, if you were in a bad keynote, you'd be sitting on your hands, wondering if everyone else was as bored as you. Suddenly, you didn't have to wonder because you could follow the hashtag. You could see what people were thinking. And the atmosphere in a room would change. If it was bad enough, the people in the audience would get the confidence to challenge the people on the stage. In 2008, we were seeing that at tech conferences. By 2011, something like it was happening on the scale of countries. And now we get to the core of why it's difficult for existing institutions to understand the world right now. Because after the events of the past year, after WikiLeaks and the Arab Spring, Anonymous, Occupy, no one can pretend that these networks are just about throwing sheep at each other or hiding away in Second Life. But if we zoom in to Street View, to the human level of experience, then the fabric of the network is puzzlingly insubstantial. Most of the activity that makes it up is the kind of thing that looks loose and haphazard, too small to be significant by the standards of the world we grew up in. And the same thing applies to these learning spaces. If you put the places I've been talking about next to the high schools and colleges we know, they're like ants next to elephants. I don't imagine there are many university vice-chancellors lying in bed at night, losing sleep over the threat from Access Space or the Temporary School of Thought. But I think this might be the gap through which the network disruption comes. Because just as the record industry, against the evidence of history, seems to be in denial that music could exist without it, so our educational institutions and the people who run them find it almost impossible to imagine that these deep social goods at the heart of education could find new homes that are unrecognizably different to the classrooms and bureaucracies that they're used to. And meanwhile, in these improvised spaces of learning, the young people who I meet are full of life and purpose in a way that reminds me of Tahrir Square and Zuccotti Park and the squares in Spain. They have the kind of passion and the kind of curiosity that led to Pick Me Up and School of Everything and Space Makers, but they also have a passion and sense of urgency that goes far further than what we had 10 years ago. And a lot of that is coming out of the sense of crisis. You know, we're talking about a generation in many countries around the world for whom the promises of our education systems and economies are not coming true. Kids who have been told, go to a good school, get good grades, and you'll go into a good job, and they're graduating into unemployment. But my hunch is that the kinds of hacked together, improvised learning spaces I've been telling you about and that I've found inspiration in are going to prove more resilient against the disruptions ahead than universities that are built on subprime student loans. We're not headed into any kind of utopia. We know that revolutions are unpredictable and messy, and we've had plenty of evidence of that over the past year. But my hope is that these deep needs, these deep goods at the heart of education, that we might just be making a bit more room for them in the society that we're stumbling into as we learn how to make the best of these networks than there was in the institutions that most of us grew up in. And if that's right, if the invisible college is already coming into being around the world, then really the challenge is to learn how to see it, to recognize deep social goods when they come to us in new and unexpected forms, and not to hold on too tightly to the institutions and the structures that we grew up taking for granted. Thank you.